Welcome to our interview series on Technology Impact Assessment, otherwise known as TIA. My name is Katina Michael. I'm a visiting scientist at Arizona State University and also a fellow at the Social Cyber Institute in Australia. This interview is part of the Australia-India Joint Impact Assessment of Critical Technologies for Peace and Stability project. It's been ongoing since November 2024, and in this series, we're focusing on technology impact assessment with respect to peace and stability. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce to everyone today Greg Austin, who is our lead uh, principal investigator on this project. Professor Greg Austin has diverse international experience in cyber policy research and international security policy. He's a senior fellow and head of the program on cyber power and future conflict with the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and also professor of cybersecurity strategy and diplomacy at the University of New South Wales in Canberra. Uh, his career has spanned many things, including fellowships as a senior visiting fellow at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. And you've also authored 10 books and on topics to do with international security and so much more. I could keep going, Greg Austin, but I'd rather you tell us about your disciplinary background and what you're doing these days.
Well, thanks, Katina. So, as you mentioned, we're engaged on this project on critical technologies, but that comes after a lengthy career in a whole range of international strategic issues and focusing on cybersecurity since around 2009. So, otherwise, not much to add to your glowing picture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to know what the impetus was. I mean, there's been a lot of conflict in the world around perhaps also the use of particular technologies, but what was the impetus behind this proposal in the first place? What was that which you sort of said, well, it's time now to go with something like this?
Well, the main, what's the word, impulse came from the availability of a grant opportunity under the Australia-India Cyber and Critical Technologies Partnership. Uh, I could see that there was quite a gap in both, well, certainly in Australian practice, and I suspected in Indian practice, of actually deep and thorough examination of the impact of emerging and critical technologies on peace and stability. And in particular, in the Australian case, I was motivated by the fact that there was this rather interesting product from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute called the Critical Technologies Tracker, which is an interesting and useful contribution to knowledge on the subject, but had arrived at a conclusion that China was in the lead in most critical technologies based on a very slim set of indicators. And that their judgment had not only seized the imagination of the Australian government, but had made world headlines and reflected the sort of emerging view in the United States that the United States was losing the technology war with China quite considerably. So I had done for the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London a comparison of US and Chinese capabilities in quantum sensing. And in that process, perhaps a little bit subjectively, I confirmed my view that by and large, governments around the world don't engage in what you might call deep analysis of the impact on peace and stability of particular technologies. They're more interested in understanding what the technology race looks like between countries like China and the United States. So, for example, they want to know which country is going to be in the lead in artificial intelligence in 10 years' time, what country is going to be in the lead in quantum sensing or in quantum computing, without really understanding, A, what that means in the lead, without really understanding deeply the technologies, and all backed up by the uh, departure point that there is a technology race and the West has to win it. And all of
Mm.
those things are worth looking at. And so I thought that we should try and get a project up under this funding scheme to see if we could tease that out a little bit more, based on my experience over many years in government, and then in academia and the think tank world, that this technology assessment was sort of slightly flawed, slightly politicized, and not all that scientific.
So tell us what you've seen as examples of technology impact assessment from things you've read and things you've been part of. What do they typically look like and how do they work?
Well, the promise of technology impact assessment, when it sort of raised its head back in the 1960s and 70s in the United States, was that uh, it would involve public consultation. It would involve extensive consultation with specialists, and it would put into the public domain the impacts on society and in all sorts of ways of these emerging technologies. Of course, the reality is that technology moved so fast and so many technologies emerged that it became difficult to maintain anything like a discipline around which technologies would be looked at, how they would be looked at. The initial Office of Technology Assessment set up in the US Congress, I think in 1972, was disestablished in the mid-1990s, but there's now part of the Government Accountability Office in the United States has picked up that function, and they've been quite active. But if you look at their website, you see that they can only look at a very small range of technologies. It's just a massive field, and understanding the impact of, uh, even say 10 main fields of artificial intelligence is beyond the capability of most organizations and individuals.
You said before some of the outcomes have been questionable coming out of technology impact assessments, depending on perhaps who's conducted them, when they've conducted them, why they've been conducting them, whether they're a third party to the sponsor organization and so forth. How might that change over time? How can uh, outcomes and assessments be more robust?
Well, the opportunity exists, strangely enough, for governments around the world to work together on joint technology assessments or multilateral technology assessments. And we've seen that work in all sorts of interesting ways. I'll mention a couple of cases a bit later, perchance, but the uh, there was a time when governments tried to do this all by themselves. So, for example, the United States government was an early uh, sort of lead in this with this concept of technology impact assessment, looking at the social and economic impacts. But its early efforts were founded or grounded in a very significant effort in the US intelligence community for technology assessment.
Hmm.
And that capability was at the time uh, profound, wide-ranging, and very capable and credible, and it has remained that way. So we have this interesting situation now where some leading governments in the world retain immense capabilities in classified arrangements for investigating the potential of technologies. Uh, and that doesn't always coincide with the public interest in any one country or what you might call international public interest. So it's sort of more or less set up to be competitive and to um, and to make it hard for outsiders to understand what sits where, what's driving what assessment, and what the reality is. As a final point on that sort of thread of conversation, let me say that in my university teaching, I have always promoted students, I've always promoted two students undertaking research in these areas to rely very heavily on the US public source documents as the very best place to look, partly because of the depth, partly because of the broad objectivity in most cases, and the public accessibility of otherwise quite sensitive information, usually coming out through the congressional hearings by various committees. So yeah, US is a good place to look, but we've reached a stage now where the range of technologies are so vast, the range of interests engaged are equally broad in scope, and there's an increasing need to manage and regulate some of these technologies, for example, artificial intelligence. But there's a growing imperative to apply advanced technologies to planetary problems like climate change. And so there's all sorts of things coming together which really dictate a more determined and more disciplined effort by all governments who have the resources to consistent, objective, and transparent technology impact assessments.
I know that when we were going through earlier research late last year and early this year, that the term technology impact assessment, oh, I'm not going to say was scarce, but was perhaps synonymized with other types of assessment. And my broader question is, what kinds of other things did you see as you were going through the literature and through your own experience? What other kinds of impact assessments were there that perhaps didn't replace TIAs or TAs, but uh, were used in some kind of specialized form? You mentioned climate and health, perhaps. Uh, were they the same? Are they different? They've got greater specificity. If we think about, for example, privacy impact assessments and technology impact assessments and child risk impact assessments or human rights impact assessments, like what did you find in the literature and were they being used synonymously, or we've gone more specific these days than just the umbrella term technology assessment?
Well, I think for the purposes of our project, looking at peace and stability, the thing we found is that in quite a few countries and internationally in terms of multilateral efforts, the idea of technology impact assessment for environmental protection is very firmly established, widely practiced, and for better or for worse in many jurisdictions, but widely practiced. The same with health impact assessments. And we saw, for example, in the COVID pandemic, the way in which national and international impact assessments, if you want to call them that, played out. And while you might not think that impact assessments were such an important part of the epidemiology of
Hmm.
the pandemic as it was emerging, the impact assessment certainly came into play with vaccine technology. And the way in which that was handled around the world was quite interesting. And the one issue that's plagued therapeutic goods administrations in various countries is whether or not to accept the certification and the assessment by other governments. So, for example, if the United States has all of this capability to assess the impact of different anti-COVID vaccinations, but other countries don't have such a great capability, why should each other smaller country attempt to take on its own impact assessment and not put faith in those of a foreign government like the United States? Of course, this was pre-Trump, of course, so all sorts of different questions arise. So there's that consideration. Uh, there is a very active, committed global community of technology impact assessment specialists. And they
Hmm.
just held a conference, in fact, in Europe called Towards Global Technology Assessment, where they're really looking to develop a global community of impact assessment specialists in many fields, from health to health, medicine, environment, education, all sorts of things. And that will continue to gather steam because uh, all countries are resource constrained when it comes to technology assessment. The European Union is a model of multilateral activity between sovereign governments, but of course it's now subsumed under this single sovereignty of the European Union, which is a unique example, a new unique situation. And the future of technology impact assessment is multilateral. It is global, uh, as long as we can find mechanisms to uh, deal with the intrusions by vested interests, people interested more in the technology arms race, so to speak, or the technology race, who's ahead and who's not. So that's the future, and we just have to find a mechanism for it. As a footnote, having observed that health technology assessments and environmental impact assessments are well established and well accepted. It's not the case for peace and stability. So the peace and stability agenda is basically the diplomacy of international security. So we're not looking at the preparation of the armed forces, we're looking at the use of diplomacy for international security purposes. And the use of collective, multilateral or bilateral technology impact assessments in that field um, is a pretty good one. It's not used, what's the word, as consistently as it might be. But we can go back, for example, to the 1970s and the arms control agreements between the USSR and the United States, which involved um, efforts by both sides, which included scientists from NATO countries as well, efforts by both sides to assess the range and lethality of various types of missiles and weapons. And that laid a foundation for transparency,
Hmm.
buttressed by the emergence of remote sensing capabilities from space and all sorts of other interesting technologies of space-based surveillance, signals interception, and the like, which firmly established in the international community the, the, the proposition that countries in a high state of global confrontation, backed up by significant military force, could find value in joint technology assessment. And that's sort of still around as a principle, but
Hmm.
it's sort of faded a little bit in the context of the US-China quote unquote confrontation. But I think it's going to re-emerge. So, for example, we have a webinar next month under this project, the final webinar in our series, where one of the scholars will present an idea for a joint China-US AI lab. So that's cutting against the grain of recent strategic policy in both countries. But that's the sort of direction that we're ultimately heading here, I think. Let me stop
That's
there.
wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And I do think there's a resurgence uh, with technology impact assessments coming not only back into fashion, unquote, quote, but I think importantly, us recognizing it as a process rather than just an artifact, rather than it being just simply a white paper or an assessment guide of, 30 pages. It's now a process, and that's coming back into the foray. And I think the complexity of technology has something to do with that. I mean, we talked about the emergence of bilateral and multilateral technology impact assessments in the examples you just provided. The question then becomes, what happens as technologies converge? We say technology impact assessment, and this links to my question on criteria within TIAs. How do we understand technology in the modern sense? What are some of the things that we should be mindful of if we're asked to do a technology impact assessment as a consulting company, a regulator, or somebody working within a defense unit or a research unit within defense? What's your advice? What's going on today, firstly, with the phenomena of technology and technological convergence, and how do we unpack that in technology impact assessments? And then what kind of criteria are we looking at?
That's a tough question. So the at the outset, there is always a purpose for a technology assessment, unless it's something based exclusively in a university, for example. So it's hard to escape, nor would we want to escape that initial purpose. And so we could take, for example, the case of machine learning or different aspects of artificial intelligence and see that different governments around the world will have different purposes. So, for example, we found that the Indian government has a much higher emphasis on use of these emerging technologies for development purposes,
Hmm.
whereas governments like Australia take the economic application of advanced technologies more or less as a given, um, to buy off the shelf according to the uses that have been well established overseas for uh, advanced agriculture or whatever in the economy, robotics, for example, in industry. And so that initial purpose is always important. And if we're looking at peace and stability, the degree to which a government actively pursues a peace and stability agenda around technology differs quite considerably from country to country. And the Australian government, to its credit, along with India, have been pursuing some aspects of the peace and stability agenda, the diplomacy for security, around critical technologies. But in neither case has that been a primary motivating factor. And so what we'd like to see change is how those two governments can elevate technology assessment to a greater prominence in the diplomacy of peace and stability. And so we're working on a paper to that effect right now. And it's going to be hard to convince the two governments to take up this sort of challenge. One of the background issues is that all governments are heavily involved in multilateral organizations, whether it's the International Telecommunications Union, whether it's the International Civil Aviation Organization. They've all got to do various types of technology impact assessment within those frameworks. So there's more or less, what's the word, a very high demand that for tech assessment that most governments can't meet.
Talk to us about some of your specializations. I mean, you've analyzed many different aspects of different technologies, including nuclear and much more. Uh, Quantum computing as well. Tell us some of the complexities with saying, let's assess quantum computing, but how in its application? Like, where do we start? Where do we stop? Is scope an issue? Can you give us some kind of way to think about it within the context of a TIA?
The start point is the purpose.
Hmm.
So the Department of Defense in the United States or in Australia will be analysing these things differently from the way in which uh, organisations like ICT for Peace, which is an NGO to promote use of advanced technology and promotion of peace, but also ICT for development. So it's a very diverse field depending on that start point, the purpose.
Yeah.
Uh, the I think it is interesting to look at the national security interest, the hard national security interest, because that does colour what else is going on in the sorts of areas we're interested. So the US Department of Defense has been studying foreign technology for a century at least, and they've done a very good job of it. They are the world leaders, or they have been the world leaders, and part of their remit has always been to buttress the national security capability, the military capability of the United States. And that's a very different purpose from supporting peace diplomacy. I mean, they're linked, and we can get back to that later. But so during the Cold War, the CIA and other arms of the US Armed Forces, or arms of the US Armed Forces, undertook extensive scientific and technical intelligence activity, collecting information on largely the Soviet Union and China in the 1980s. That focused more on Japan, surprisingly. But the ambition was to make sure that the enemy or potential adversary did not get hold of a military technology that could quickly undermine the balance of strategic power or give a surprising advantage on the battlefield. So it was all about avoiding technology surprise or technical surprise in military development. And the processes which the CIA and other agencies followed all pretty much now revealed through not freedom of information. The CIA released most of its pre-1991
Hmm.
intelligence assessments in respect of the Soviet Union in the mid-90s. And we can see quite clearly the centrality of the technology assessments, how capable were the new missiles, and what sort of munitions load could they deliver, and so on, what new technologies were there for surveillance, and so on. And that was a powerful effort. And just to give you an indicator of the current size of that effort, you'll find this a staggering figure. But the CIA has revealed publicly that there are 10,000 cleared companies in the United States that it can draw on to help evaluate the technology significance or the technical significance of new developments in foreign countries affecting only intelligence.
Mm,
So it's not the CIA doing the broad sweep of
mm,
technology impact on military capability, but it's got 10,000 cleared companies which it can rely on for help in this technology assessment process. No country in the world can match that scale of capability or that level of organization. The
mm,
Brits go close, and I'm sure the French similarly in terms of the closeness of their relationships between the private sector and government in making these sorts of assessments. But historically, no one has done it for the past 5 or 6 decades. Anybody anyway like the United States has done it, and what foreign governments are trying to do now is sort of emulate that effort and understand how it can be achieved multilaterally. So the countries of NATO um, work very closely on this. The Five Eyes countries work very closely on this sort of technology assessment, especially when it affects intelligence capability. Yeah, what am I saying? Uh, what goes into a technology assessment? Well, it depends who's asking and what the question is. But let me
yeah,
just make a quick comment on the quantum uh,
please.
science and technology issue. So countries around the world are coming up with these lists of critical technologies, and all of them include artificial intelligence and quantum technologies. And then you have think tanks around the world and governments saying things like, well, we think China's getting ahead in AI or China's getting ahead in quantum technology. And they cite this or that narrow range of statistics or indicators to demonstrate that. But when you look very closely at any of those broad technology headings like AI, but it's quantum technology in particular, you immediately encounter the need to investigate the subfields.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in quantum technologies, there's quantum sensing, quantum computing, uh, uh, and quantum communications at least. And then in all of those subfields, those three subfields, there are these sort of sub-technologies which are profoundly important and which have to be assessed. And the study that I did for the IISS on quantum sensing uh, dug a little bit into the patent activity of the two countries in those subfields to
Yeah.
reveal that, for example, in quantum sensing, in some of the subfields, the US was clearly ahead of China, uh, and profoundly so. In a couple of the subfields, China was ahead of the United States in basic science and research. And a very interesting example out of all of that was a case of quantum radar. So the Pentagon produced a list of uh, sub-technologies which it thought were important to the security of the United States at a certain point, the Defense Science Board. And part of their work made the conclusion that the United States wasn't that interested in quantum radar. Their scientists were advising that the problems of fuzziness of the data, whatever the correct term is, would not be solved, in the next decade or two in the quantum field.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're in a situation where the Pentagon does not actively pursue quantum radar. China does. So if you look at the scientific literature on quantum radar, who's got most who's got most publications and who's more advanced? Well, it's China. Interestingly, the Australian government is interested in quantum radar.
Yeah.
So it's sort of falling between the two. But so you've got to look very closely. Subfields like photonics. There are subfields of quantum sensing in which China doesn't even register in the top 10 of scientific papers.
Mm-hmm.
But countries like the United States, of course, Australia, Germany, Japan, India, and even Iran appear in some of these lists of the top 10 where China doesn't. So let me
Well,
stop there.
I think this is entirely fascinating. There are lots of capabilities now that have been introduced through AI for us to be able to inspect patent databases, to be able to inspect lots of different things. You mentioned the 10,000 organizations that have been cleared to provide intelligence to federal level intelligence organizations in the US, and I have seen products and services now available to anyone who has money to pay through third parties that have said, "Oh, so you want to do a stakeholder analysis on these entities in this particular technology? Well, let me do my searching, and voila, my query says, with some kind of level of confidence,
Yeah.
this is what's going on." And it's fascinating to see these competitions now, at least the data being uncovered in ways that wasn't available previously, because we can make these comparisons beyond searching for bibliometrics in Scopus and Web of Science, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now
Yeah.
there's the ability to crawl through the internet and find things if it is open source intelligence. But this leads me to a question, knowing we don't have too long to go in our interview. It leads me to the question of stakeholders and multiple stakeholders being required for technology impact assessments. You've mentioned a couple already, and you've mentioned relationships between various stakeholders. Give me a stakeholder list of who should typically be involved or engaged in a technology impact assessment, and perhaps in contrast to who really is today.
Thanks, Katina. Well, the original concept of technology impact assessment was about involving the community, informing the community, involving the legislators, and making sure that a variety of stakeholders, all of the necessary stakeholders, would be involved. So, for environmental impact assessment, that meant communities affected. How was their environment going to be changed by such and such an activity? Not so much a technology initially, but certainly that came on. What's different a little bit about the peace and stability of field is that engagement of the public is very different, because there's not so many people in the public domain interested in individual technologies. Interestingly, we found in our first paper that the issue of nuclear waste and nuclear accident management for visiting nuclear warships was an issue which engaged wide swathes of the Australian community, and is an interesting, well, it's an exception really in
Mm,
terms of the level of engagement you'll get from most communities and legislators in respect of technologies impacting on peace and stability. So by and large, the Parliament of Australia, and even to some extent the Parliament of the United States, Congress, and certainly the Parliament of India, have not paid a lot of attention to the impacts on the community, or community groups of military technologies or security related technologies. They tend to bypass them. And even today, having just been reading some documents from the Australian government on cybersecurity, the preference is to work with industry and make sure the relations between industry and government are fine, but pay no attention to the community impacts. So resilience for cybersecurity is currently defined by the Australian government almost exclusively in terms of the relationship between government and industry, with very little discussion of community interests. And I think we can safely take the view that that's an old-fashioned way of proceeding with these security interests. There needs to be a channel for more regular consideration of community interests. And we found, I think, in the Australian case that that is best exercised and most frequently exercised by the National Parliament through its committee system, where they hold inquiries, and they take submissions from a wide range of stakeholders. The bad news is that the committees have very small staffs in the Australian Parliament. They don't have the capability to absorb the technical detail, and the nor actually expose the impact on communities of the technologies that they're looking at. The level of education about what's involved in the subfields of artificial intelligence in Australia, or the levels of knowledge of the subfields of quantum sensing, is pretty low. And that's one reason why it's important to find new mechanisms including international mechanisms to bring more resources to bear for higher priority topics. And in few countries is there a process for determining the priority list of these
Hmm.
technologies and how we should analyze their impact. It's pretty hit or miss, and uh, I think you've done some work on privacy, which I think would probably provide a bit of a counter to that privacy impact assessment. It's very different in some countries, and in Europe they give a huge priority to privacy impact assessments of new technologies. In Australia, not so much.
Yeah, I think you hit on some vital points there, and often consumers and citizens are considered to be the readers of these, but they can only read what's available publicly. They can't
Yeah.
read things that have been, you know, created behind the scenes, or at least, with high levels of security clearance required. The other thing I think about, as you allude to, I have been on the board of the Australian Privacy Foundation since 2008, coming out of industry. It's the oldest privacy foundation in the world, but the third sector could contribute greatly to technology impact assessments if invited to. A lot of the people on these boards are either retired or actively engaged in industry work mainly, and this is a volunteerism after hours that they engage in, and a lot of them have responded to public consultations through Senate committee hearings and so forth, and well documented in Hansard in Australia's context. But you run out of steam. And as you said, it's a resource issue. It's a technical skills issue. It's an issue where if we want more people engaged, we have to invite them and remunerate them. Unfortunately, remuneration when we have even citizen participation in these kinds of committee standings is zero. Perhaps you might be fortunate if you get your transportation covered, uh, but even that is not usually. It's coming out of your own pocket. So there is a lot of things that can happen. You've alluded to many of these, but perhaps my last question to you, and I know you've got so much to say. I mean, it's almost worth another interview with you, but let's just say this was the last question I was able to ask you. You've talked about bilateral and potential multilateral technology impact assessment. Walk us through how might bilateral technology impact assessment work? Does one country do TIA and another country does their TIA? They walk down that road and then they come together at various points of a life cycle, of a technology life cycle, or they're already in communion from the beginning, and they walk that path together, or some other concoction that you've been thinking about. How does it work in practice?
Well, I think there are very many different types of experience that two countries have had in this sort of process. In some cases, for example, where countries have disagreed on the military significance of this or that technology, um, they're coming to it with already formed ideas and quite well established research backgrounds and research data and research papers. And so it's really debating about the findings of the research, but the impact for joint technology assessment really arises more in those sorts of cases from the need to resolve the dispute. And one notable case was between Russia and the United States, where they agreed to undertake a joint assessment of Iran's nuclear and missile potential because they had different um, assessments of that. Uh, but the reason why it became more important was that because the United States was basing anti-missile radars in Europe, ostensibly to monitor Iranian missiles potentially attacking Europe, where Russia was saying, well, you don't need those anti-missile radars in Europe because Iran's missiles can't reach that far. And anyway, they're not close to establishing a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
So that was a point of considerable discussion back in the late, 2009 period where I had some exposure to that process. The On issues which are less sensitive, uh, especially things like health and environment. And environment, both of those involve transnational considerations. Health issues cross borders, and environmental damage can cross borders. So that's fairly well established at the international level. So, and I think it's just so varied according to the issue. There will be long-standing research capability in some of those areas. In some cases, it'll be novel, and governments have to work out how to uh, set it up. But I think the lesson of our research is that you've got to have a more visible center of gravity for these sorts of assessments, both whether it's at the national level or the bilateral level or a multilateral level. And if you don't have that uh, center of gravity, which has got the depth in technology impact assessment, you're really sort of starting behind the eight ball, and you can be so far better ahead if you institutionalize the practice of technology impact assessment. You can't do it for every issue. You can't be well advanced in research on all the background issues, but you've got to start somewhere and you've got to set your priorities. And in the case of Australia and India, find the mutually agreeable priorities affecting peace and stability for this sort of work.
Well, Greg, on that point, I think we'll leave it there for today. And just to thank you for your insights. It's been incredible working with you since last year. I think it was March. We came together and with Glenn Withers, Lisa Maturano, and the rest of the team, we have a wonderful social cyber institute that has lots of fantastic fellows that are active in this space and beyond. And I just want to thank you for your leadership. It's really added something new, I think internationally, not just nationally. And it's been a pleasure listening to your responses in this interview today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Katina. Feeling is mutual. You've added a great impetus to our work and deep expertise. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Bye
All
bye
right.
for now.
Catch you later. Bye.
Catch you later.